A millionaire saw an elderly woman asking for a plate of food at the traffic light. Moved, he offered to donate a large sum of money. She refused right away and said she wanted something else. And the millionaire only cried when he heard what she told him. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The bitter February wind whipped through the streets of Kensington, London, carrying with it the last remnants of winter's chill. Margaret Spencer, her weathered hands trembling slightly, stood at her usual spot outside the upscale shops, clutching a small paper cup filled with a few copper coins. At 81, she cut a striking figure despite her circumstances. Her silver hair was neatly combed, her clothes, though worn, were impeccably clean, and her blue eyes retained a spark of dignity that decades of hardship had failed to extinguish. The morning crowd hurried past, their designer boots clicking against the pavement, their faces buried in phones or hidden behind takeaway coffee cups. Margaret had learned to become invisible to them, a skill honed over the 3 years since she'd lost her tiny flat in Hammersmith after her pension couldn't keep up with London's soaring rents. "Spare some change, love?" she would ask softly, her refined accent betraying her middle-class upbringing. Most days, she earned just enough for a meal at the local cafe and perhaps a cup of tea. Pride kept her from accepting more than she needed, even when the occasional kind soul offered larger sums. That particular morning, as the clouds gathered ominously overhead, Margaret noticed a sleek black Bentley pulling up to the curb. The window rolled down, revealing a man in his early 40s, his expression troubled despite his obvious wealth. James Richardson, CEO of one of Britain's largest tech companies, had just left another meaningless board meeting, the emptiness in his chest growing deeper with each passing day. "Sir," Margaret approached carefully, her arthritis making each step deliberate. "Would you perhaps have a moment to spare?" James looked up, initially prepared to dismiss her with the practiced indifference of the wealthy. But something in Margaret's bearing made him pause. She stood there with an almost regal posture, her chin held high despite her circumstances. "Actually," he found himself saying, "I could use some company for lunch. Would you care to join me?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but her dignity remained intact. "That's very kind, sir, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Please," James insisted, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "There's a lovely little place around the corner. Best shepherd's pie in London." As they sat in the cozy warmth of the restaurant, Margaret's story unfolded like a well-worn novel. She had been a primary school teacher for 40 years, dedicating her life to educating children in some of London's poorest neighbourhoods. When her modest pension proved insufficient against the city's ruthless housing market, she found herself joining the growing ranks of elderly homeless. "The hardest part," she confided, carefully cutting her shepherd's pie into small, manageable pieces, "isn't the cold or the hunger. It's the invisibility. People look right through you as if aging and poverty have somehow made you less human." James listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. His own mother, ensconced in her Chelsea mansion, had recently been commenting on his withdrawn nature, his lack of purpose despite his financial success. Here was a woman who had nothing, yet spoke with more passion and dignity than anyone he'd encountered in his corporate boardrooms. As lunch drew to a close, James reached for his wallet, intending to give Margaret enough money to last her several months. But before he could, she stood up, straightening her worn coat. "Thank you for lunch and the conversation," she said warmly. "It's been a pleasure to be seen again, even if just for an hour." "Wait," James called out, holding out several £50 notes. "Please, take this. It's the least I can do." Margaret smiled, but shook her head. "I appreciate the gesture, but I only accept what I need for the day. Anything more would feel like taking advantage of your kindness." That moment of principled refusal changed something in James. Here was someone who had every right to take advantage of his generosity, yet chose dignity over convenience. Before she could leave, he made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. "Margaret," he said, standing up, "I have a proposition for you. One that might benefit us both." As rain began to fall outside the restaurant windows, neither of them could have predicted how their chance encounter would ripple through their lives, challenging prejudices, healing old wounds, and teaching lessons about the true meaning of family and worth that no amount of money could buy. The rain had intensified by the time James and Margaret left the restaurant, transforming London's streets into mirrors that reflected the grey sky above. James insisted on driving Margaret to her usual shelter, but instead of saying goodbye, he found himself sharing the vision that had formed during their lunch. "I have a house in Hampstead," he began, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. "Then it's far too large for just me, and I've been thinking—" He paused, suddenly aware of how presumptuous his offer might sound. "Would you consider coming to stay? Not as a charity case, but as a companion of sorts." Margaret's weathered hands clutched her worn handbag tighter. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Richardson, but surely you understand how unusual it would be." "Please call me James," he insisted. "And yes, I know it's unconventional, but I've learned more about life in one lunch with you than I have in years of business meetings. My house, it's just a building filled with expensive things. It needs someone who understands the difference between worth and value." The proposition hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Margaret gazed out at the rain-streaked windows, remembering her own comfortable home from years past, before circumstances had stripped away everything but her dignity. "Your family might not understand," she said softly, her teacher's instinct for identifying potential problems coming to the fore. James's expression tightened slightly. "My mother, Lady Victoria Richardson, can be traditional in her views, but this is my house and my decision." After much gentle persuasion and practical discussion, Margaret agreed to a trial period. James drove them to the shelter where she kept her few belongings: a small suitcase containing carefully maintained clothes, a photo album, and a collection of well-worn paperback classics. The drive to Hampstead took them through progressively more affluent neighbourhoods until they reached James's home, a Victorian mansion set behind wrought-iron gates. As they pulled into the circular driveway, Margaret couldn't help but notice a sleek Jaguar already parked there. "James, darling," Lady Victoria's voice rang out from the front door before they had even stepped out of the car. "I've been trying to reach you all afternoon." Her voice trailed off as she noticed Margaret emerging from the passenger side. Lady Victoria Richardson cut an imposing figure in her Chanel suit and perfectly coiffed silver hair. Her expression shifted from surprise to confusion to barely concealed horror as James explained the situation. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she hissed, pulling James aside while Margaret waited politely by the car. "You can't simply bring a homeless person to live in your house. What will people say? What about your position in society?" "Mother," James replied firmly. "Margaret was a teacher for 40 years. She's educated, refined, and has more genuine class than half the people at your charity galas." "But darling, you don't know anything about her. She could be anyone." She could be exactly what this house needs," James interrupted. "When was the last time you saw me genuinely interested in anything beyond quarterly reports?" Lady Victoria pressed her perfectly manicured fingers to her temples. "At least let me have my private investigator look into her background." "No, Mother. This isn't a corporate merger. This is about giving someone a chance, and maybe giving myself one too." Inside the house, Margaret stood in the marble-floored entrance hall, taking in the careful blend of traditional architecture and modern luxury. A young housekeeper, Emma, appeared with a tentative smile, clearly unsure how to react to this unexpected addition to the household. "Emma," James said warmly, "this is Margaret Spencer. She'll be staying with us. Could you please show her to the blue room in the east wing?" As Emma led Margaret upstairs, Lady Victoria cornered her son in his study. "James, I understand you're going through some sort of phase. The therapist said you might act out after the divorce, but this is beyond acceptable. What would your father say if he were here?" "Dad would probably understand better than anyone," James replied quietly. "He always said our wealth came with responsibility. Well, I'm finally taking some." The first evening passed in a fog of awkward dinner conversation and thinly veiled tension. Margaret, despite her years on the streets, displayed impeccable table manners and an extensive knowledge of literature that even Lady Victoria couldn't fault. Yet the older woman's disapproving glances spoke volumes about the battles that lay ahead. As Margaret settled into her new room that night, running her hands over the silk bedspread and staring out at the illuminated garden, she wondered if she had made the right decision. The comfort was undeniable, but comfort often came with hidden costs. In her experience, kindness from strangers usually had strings attached. Meanwhile, in his study, James sat with a glass of whiskey, wondering the same thing. But when he remembered the spark of life he'd felt during lunch, the way Margaret's stories had awakened something long dormant in his soul, he knew he couldn't go back to his empty existence. Lady Victoria, in her own wing of the house, made several phone calls to her social circle, trying to damage control what she saw as an impending scandal. Yet even she had to admit there was something about Margaret that didn't fit her prejudices, a quiet dignity that spoke of better days and better circumstances. As the rain continued to fall outside, 3 very different people lay awake in the same house, each contemplating how their lives had collided in such an unexpected way, and each wondering how this unusual arrangement would transform their carefully ordered world. The first week in the Richardson mansion brought a series of subtle adjustments and quiet revelations. Margaret rose early each morning, a habit ingrained from years of street life, and found herself drawn to the mansion's vast library. The room, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather armchairs, became her sanctuary in these uncertain days. One morning, Emma, the housekeeper, found Margaret reorganizing a shelf of classic literature, her experienced teacher's hands moving with purpose despite their arthritis. "Mrs. Spencer," Emma said, bringing in a tray of tea, "you don't need to do that. It's my job to maintain the library." Margaret turned, offering a warm smile. "My dear, when you've taught English literature for 4 decades, organizing books isn't work. It's therapy. And please call me Margaret." Emma hesitated, then sat down as Margaret poured them both tea. "I've never seen anyone actually use this library before," she confided. "Mr. Richardson is always at the office, and Lady Victoria only comes in here during social gatherings to impress guests." As they chatted, Emma revealed more about the household dynamics. James's divorce 2 years ago had left him withdrawn and focused solely on work. Lady Victoria had moved in shortly after, claiming to help him through the transition, but mostly seemed intent on orchestrating his return to high society. Their conversation was interrupted by Lady Victoria's arrival, her Louboutin heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with barely concealed disapproval. "Emma, I believe the silver needs polishing," she said pointedly. As Emma hurried out, Lady Victoria turned to Margaret. "I see you're making yourself quite at home." "Books have always been faithful friends," Margaret replied evenly. "They don't judge by appearance or circumstance." Lady Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, well, speaking of appearances, I'm having some friends over for afternoon tea today. Perhaps you'd prefer to take your meals in your room." Before Margaret could respond, James's voice came from behind them. "Mother, Margaret is not a secret to be hidden away. She lives here now." He had been working from home that morning, a rare occurrence that his mother had been quick to attribute to Margaret's presence. In truth, James had found himself increasingly drawn to the house, fascinated by the subtle changes Margaret's presence had brought. "Darling," Lady Victoria began, but James cut her off. "In fact, I insist that Margaret join us for tea. Many of your friends are on educational charity boards. They might be interested in her experiences teaching in underprivileged areas." The afternoon tea proved to be a turning point. Margaret, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit that Emma had helped her choose from her modest wardrobe, captivated Lady Victoria's friends with stories from her teaching days. Her particular triumph was engaging Lady Pembroke, a notoriously difficult woman, in a lengthy discussion about the modernist poetry they had both studied at Oxford, decades apart. "My dear," Lady Pembroke said to Lady Victoria as they were leaving, "where did you find her? Such a refreshing change from the usual social climbers. We must have her speak at our next educational foundation meeting." Lady Victoria's expression was a complex mixture of surprise and calculation. Later that evening, she found Margaret back in the library, reading by lamplight. "You went to Oxford?" she asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of her voice. Margaret looked up from her book. "First in my family to attend university, studied English literature at St. Hilda's College. Life takes unexpected turns, Lady Victoria. Status can be lost, but education remains." For the first time, Lady Victoria found herself truly looking at Margaret, seeing beyond the circumstances that had brought her to their door. "Please," she said, her voice slightly softer, "call me Victoria." Meanwhile, James had noticed other changes in the house. Emma smiled more, the gardens seemed better tended, and even the cook reported that the kitchen had a warmer atmosphere. Margaret had a way of making people feel seen and appreciated. a skill honed through decades of teaching. One evening, as James passed by Margaret's room, he heard her talking on the phone, an old flip phone he'd given her for emergencies. She was speaking to someone at her former shelter, offering advice and encouragement. Even without a home of her own, she had never stopped trying to help others. The conversation reminded him of his own charitable giving, generous but detached, done through foundations and committees. Margaret's way was different, personal, immediate, and transformative. That night, unable to sleep, James found himself in the library. Margaret was there too, a habit they were both developing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, until James spoke. "I used to think success was about numbers in a bank account," he said quietly. "But watching you these past days, you have something I've been missing, a purpose beyond just accumulating wealth." Margaret set down her book. "Purpose isn't found in grand gestures, James. It's in the small kindnesses, the daily choices to make life a bit better for others. You have the means to do so much good. You just need to see the opportunities." As they talked into the night, neither noticed Lady Victoria, watching silently from the doorway, her own carefully constructed worldview beginning to shift, ever so slightly, on its axis. Spring had begun to soften London's edges, when the first real crisis struck the delicate balance at the Richardson mansion. Lady Victoria's prized sapphire brooch, a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations, disappeared after one of her charity committee meetings. The morning began ordinarily enough. Margaret had been helping Emma arrange flowers for the committee meeting, adding her artistic touch to the elaborate displays. Lady Victoria had actually smiled at their efforts, a small but significant shift from her initial frosty demeanor. "These arrangements remind me of the ones my grandmother used to create," she had commented, adjusting her sapphire brooch, a stunning piece featuring a central blue stone surrounded by diamonds. "She always said flowers should look as though they grew naturally in their vases." The committee meeting proceeded smoothly, with Margaret discreetly helping in the kitchen, despite Lady Victoria's assurance that she was welcome to join them. "I prefer to be useful," Margaret had said, knowing that some of the committee members still viewed her presence in the house with curiosity and barely concealed judgment. It wasn't until evening, as Lady Victoria was preparing for dinner, that the brooch's absence was discovered. "It's gone," her voice echoed through the house, bringing James running from his study and Emma hurrying up the stairs. "I always pin it to my jewelry cushion after meetings, but it's not there." The search began systematically. Emma and the other staff members carefully went through the drawing room where the meeting had been held. James called the committee members to ask if anyone had noticed the brooch falling off during the afternoon. Lady Victoria paced the halls, growing increasingly agitated. "It must be here somewhere, unless—" She left the sentence hanging, but her eyes darted toward the east wing where Margaret's room was located. James noticed the look. "Mother, don't even think it. Margaret would never. Darling, I know you want to believe in her, but we really don't know anything about her life on the streets. Desperate circumstances can change people." "The Margaret I know refused extra money when she was living rough," James argued. "She's never shown any interest in material possessions." Nevertheless, rumors began to circulate among the staff. Margaret couldn't help but notice the changed atmosphere, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the subtle distancing of people who had begun to warm to her presence. That evening, as Margaret sat in her room, she heard a knock at the door. It was Emma, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Spencer, Margaret, Lady Victoria has requested that all rooms be searched. For thoroughness, you understand?" Margaret stood up, her back straight despite the pain that age and arthritis brought. "Of course. Please do what you need to do." She watched silently as Emma conducted a careful but respectful search of her few belongings. The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly as she went through Margaret's small suitcase, checking pockets and corners. James appeared in the doorway, his face dark with anger. "This is unnecessary, Emma. You can stop." "Let her finish, James," Margaret said quietly. "Sometimes trust needs to be proven before it can be given freely." The search revealed nothing, but the damage was done. That night, Margaret sat at her writing desk, penning a letter she had hoped never to write. Her weathered hands moved slowly across the paper, choosing each word with care. Meanwhile, downstairs, James confronted his mother. "Are you satisfied now? You've humiliated a woman who has shown nothing but grace since arriving here." Lady Victoria fingered the empty space on her dress where the brooch usually sat. "James, you don't understand. That brooch isn't just about monetary value. It's about family, heritage, everything we stand for." "And what exactly do we stand for, Mother? Because right now, I'm not very proud of what we're showing the world." The next morning, Margaret's room was empty. On the perfectly made bed lay an envelope addressed to James. Inside was a letter, written in the elegant hand of a long-time teacher. "Dear James, your kindness has meant more than you can know, but I cannot stay where trust is broken. You opened your home to me, but a home requires more than walls and a roof. It needs understanding and faith in one another. I leave with the same dignity I arrived with, taking nothing but the memories of your generosity and the hope that this experience has opened your heart to helping others in need. Please thank Emma for her kindness and tell your mother I understand her position more than she might think. Sometimes our greatest fears come from the things we value most. With deepest gratitude, Margaret." James stood in the empty room, the letter trembling in his hands, when Emma burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Richardson, the brooch, we found it. It had fallen into the laundry basket when Lady Victoria was changing yesterday. It was tangled in one of her scarves." The discovery came too late. Margaret had slipped away in the early morning hours, leaving no clue as to where she might have gone. James stared out the window at the spring garden she had helped tend, feeling a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with missing jewelry. Lady Victoria appeared in the doorway, the recovered brooch pinned firmly to her dress, her face showing the first real signs of regret since Margaret had arrived. London in spring can be a deceptively beautiful place, its parks blooming with daffodils and cherry blossoms, while cold winds still whip through its streets. James spent days searching these streets, retracing the paths where he had first met Margaret, his expensive suits gathering dirt as he checked shelters and soup kitchens. Lady Victoria, contrary to everyone's expectations, joined the search. Her Jaguar became a familiar sight outside homeless centres and charity kitchens across London, her Hermes scarves and perfectly styled hair looking increasingly out of place as she ventured into areas she'd previously only discussed in charity committee meetings. "She was here last week," a volunteer at St. Martin's soup kitchen told them. "Helped serve meals for a few hours, then disappeared. That's Margaret for you, always giving, never taking." Emma had taken to preparing extra sandwiches each morning, which James distributed during his searches. "She taught me her recipe," Emma explained, carefully wrapping each sandwich. "Cucumber with a touch of mint. Said it was proper enough for tea with the Queen, but simple enough for anyone to enjoy." The house felt different in Margaret's absence. The library stood silent, its books seemingly duller without her presence. The garden flowers she had helped arrange began to wilt, and even the morning light seemed less warm without her quiet appreciation of it. Lady Victoria found herself lingering in the library, running her fingers along the spines of books Margaret had reorganized. She picked up a volume of poetry, surprised to find careful annotations in Margaret's elegant handwriting on a slip of paper tucked inside. "Poetry," the note read, "is not the luxury of the educated. It is the breath of human dignity, found even in the hardest circumstances." One afternoon, as James prepared to go out searching again, Lady Victoria stopped him in the foyer. "I've been thinking," she said, adjusting her recovered brooch nervously, "about what Margaret said in her letter, about understanding my position. You see, when I was young, before I married your father, my family lost everything in a bad investment. We kept up appearances, but for one terrible year, we were on the brink of ending up exactly where Margaret did." James stared at his mother, seeing her in a new light. "You never told me. Pride, darling. It becomes a habit. Your grandfather's business deal saved us, and I married your father, and life became about maintaining position, keeping up appearances. I thought I was protecting our family by being suspicious of Margaret, but instead, I've only proved that I learned nothing from my own brush with misfortune." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lady Pembroke called, her voice excited. "Victoria, dear, you'll never believe who I've just seen at the Chelsea Physic Garden. She was volunteering with their educational program, teaching children about Victorian flower meanings. Such a marvelous way with the little ones." James and Lady Victoria rushed to the gardens, but by the time they arrived, Margaret had already left. However, The children's education coordinator remembered her well. "Oh yes, Mrs. Spencer, wonderful with the children. She's been helping with our historical botany program. She mentioned something about heading to the British Library afterward, said she wanted to research some teaching materials." At the British Library, they finally found her, seated at a reading desk, surrounded by books about educational outreach programs. She looked up as they approached, her face showing surprise but maintaining its usual dignity. "Margaret," James said softly, "please come home." She shook her head gently. "I'm not sure that's wise. Trust, once broken, can be rebuilt," Lady Victoria interrupted, stepping forward. She unpinned the sapphire brooch from her jacket. "Like this brooch, trust is a family heirloom. It needs to be cherished, protected, but most importantly, shared with those who become family, not by blood, but by choice." Margaret's eyes widened as Lady Victoria held out the brooch to her. "Victoria, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Lady Victoria insisted. "Wear it to the Educational Foundation meeting next week. You're speaking about innovative teaching methods for underprivileged children, by the way. Lady Pembroke's already arranged it." For a moment, the three of them stood in the hushed atmosphere of the library, surrounded by centuries of written wisdom, while an unwritten chapter of their own story waited to begin. Finally, Margaret reached out, her weathered hand touching not the brooch but Lady Victoria's arm. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we could work on that presentation together. I have some ideas about combining traditional methods with modern needs." It wasn't a direct acceptance, but it was a beginning. As they left the library together, other patrons might have noticed an unusual sight. A distinguished older woman walking between a corporate-looking gentleman and an elegantly dressed lady, all three of them smiling as if they shared a secret about what really makes a family. The return to the Richardson mansion marked not just Margaret's physical homecoming, but the beginning of a profound transformation within the household. The first change came in the form of Lady Victoria's decision to move Margaret from the East Wing guest room to the family suite adjacent to the library. "It makes more sense," Lady Victoria insisted, overseeing the relocation herself. "You're in that library more than anyone else in this house's history. Besides, these rooms have better light for reading." The rooms in question had belonged to James's grandmother, and their renovation became an unexpected bonding project. Margaret and Lady Victoria spent hours discussing color schemes and furniture arrangements, their conversations gradually shifting from decor to deeper matters. "Your grandmother," Margaret observed one afternoon, running her hand along a restored writing desk. "She must have been quite the intellectual." She was referring to the collection of first-edition classics found in the room's built-in bookshelf. "She was," Lady Victoria smiled, carefully arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. "Cambridge-educated, class of 1932, quite scandalous for her time. I think that's why this house has always had such an extensive library." The renovation project sparked something new in James as well. He began leaving the office earlier, genuinely interested in the changes taking place in his home. One evening, he found Margaret and his mother poring over old family photo albums. "James, darling," Lady Victoria called out, "come look at these. We found your grandfather's journals from his days working with educational charities in the East End." The journals revealed a family legacy of social involvement that had somehow been forgotten in the pursuit of wealth and status. James's grandfather had been instrumental in establishing several schools for underprivileged children in post-war London. "It's rather like things coming full circle," Margaret mused, adjusting her reading glasses. "Your grandfather building schools, and now here we are, planning educational outreach programs." The Educational Foundation meeting proved to be a turning point. Margaret, wearing Victoria's sapphire brooch, presented their joint proposal for a new initiative combining traditional teaching methods with modern technology to help elderly educators connect with underprivileged students. "There's a wealth of experience out there," Margaret explained to the rapt audience. "Former teachers and professionals who have so much to offer but have been sidelined by circumstances or age. Why not create a bridge between them and the students who need them most?" The proposal was met with enthusiasm, particularly when James stood up and announced that his technology company would provide the necessary equipment and technical support. "It's not charity," he clarified, catching Margaret's eye. "It's an investment in human potential." Lady Pembroke was the first to sign up as a patron, followed quickly by several other influential board members. By the end of the meeting, What had started as a simple presentation had evolved into a full-fledged foundation, the Spencer Richardson Educational Trust. That evening, as they celebrated in the library, Emma brought in a special cake she'd baked for the occasion. The household staff joined in the celebration, the formal barriers between family and employees dissolving in the warmth of shared achievement. "I never thought I'd see the day," Emma confided to Margaret, when this house felt like a proper home. The transformation extended beyond the mansion's walls. James began holding regular meetings with his company's charitable foundation, exploring ways to integrate technology into educational programs. Lady Victoria's charity committees shifted their focus from social gatherings to actual community impact. Margaret's influence was subtle but profound. She didn't try to change anyone directly. Instead, she led by example, showing how simple actions and genuine care could create ripples of positive change. One morning, as Margaret tended to the window box of herbs she'd started in her new rooms, she found a small package waiting on her writing desk. Inside was a key ring with 3 keys. "The brass one is for the front door," James explained from the doorway. "The silver is for the library, and the small gold one is for the family safe." Mother insisted. "She says all the family jewelry should be accessible to you now." Margaret held the keys, feeling their weight in more ways than one. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I was teaching, I used to tell my students that education was the key to opening doors. I never imagined how literally that would turn out to be true." James smiled, remembering how far they'd come from that first meeting on a cold London street. "Sometimes," he said, "the best lessons come from unexpected teachers." Through the open window, they could hear Lady Victoria in the garden, instructing the gardener on where to plant a new bed of roses. She was planning to open the gardens for educational tours, she'd announced, to teach children about botany and Victorian flower language. "Life does have a way of blooming in the most unexpected places," Margaret said, placing her keys carefully in a small dish on her desk. The sapphire brooch caught the morning light from its new home on her lapel, its blue depths seeming to hold all the promise of their shared future. Summer arrived in London with unusual warmth, matching the atmosphere that had developed within the Richardson mansion. The Spencer Richardson Educational Trust was flourishing, having already established pilot programs in 3 London boroughs. But it was the unexpected visitors to the house that truly marked how much had changed. Every Thursday afternoon, the mansion's formal dining room transformed into a training centre. Former teachers, many of whom had fallen on hard times, gathered around the grand table to learn how to use tablets and educational software provided by James's company. "Technology needn't be intimidating," Margaret would explain, her patience evident as she helped an octogenarian former mathematics teacher navigate a virtual classroom platform. "Think of it as just another type of blackboard." Lady Victoria had surprised everyone by becoming deeply involved in these sessions, her organizational skills proving invaluable. She'd even taken to serving tea herself, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Mother," James commented one day, watching her arrange biscuits on vintage plates, "I believe you're actually enjoying this." "Well," she replied, adjusting a napkin, "one must maintain standards, even while revolutionizing education." But her smile gave away her genuine pleasure in the work. The house itself seemed to respond to its new purpose. Rooms that had been merely showcases for wealth became vibrant spaces for learning and collaboration. The library, in particular, had evolved into the heart of their operation, with Margaret's careful curation making its resources accessible to all their visitors. One particularly memorable afternoon, a familiar face appeared at the door, Sarah, a young woman from Margaret's old shelter. She stood nervously in the entrance hall until Margaret spotted her. "Sarah, you made it!" Margaret embraced the young woman warmly. "Everyone, this is one of our first success stories." Sarah, it turned out, had been a primary school teacher before a series of personal setbacks left her homeless. Through the Trust's program, she was now back in the classroom, using her experience to help children dealing with housing insecurity. "Mrs. Spencer, Margaret, showed me that setbacks don't define you," Sarah explained to the group. "They're just part of your teaching credentials in life's classroom." The impact of their work began to attract attention. Local news outlets ran features on the Trust's innovative approach to educational inequality. James found himself giving interviews about social responsibility in the tech sector. while Lady Victoria's charity circles buzzed with discussion about meaningful philanthropy rather than mere social obligations. Even Emma and the household staff had found new purpose. The housekeeper had discovered a talent for technical support, often helping troubleshoot issues with the tablets and software. The chef organized cooking classes for program participants, teaching both culinary skills and food budgeting. One evening, as Margaret sat in her rooms reviewing applications for the Trust's expanding programs, she found James at her door, looking thoughtful. "Do you remember," he asked, settling into a comfortable armchair, "that first day when I offered you a place here? I thought I was the one helping you." Margaret looked up from her papers, understanding in her eyes. "The best help always works both ways, dear boy. Your mother taught me that." "Speaking of mother," James smiled, "she's planning something. I heard her on the phone talking about a surprise celebration." Lady Victoria was indeed planning something, a gala evening to mark the Trust's successful first quarter. But unlike her previous social events, this one had a purpose beyond display. "We'll invite everyone," she announced at breakfast. "Our teachers, the students, the shelter coordinators, everyone who's part of this journey. Black tie optional, of course," she added with a wink at Margaret. The preparation for the gala consumed the household. Margaret found herself being whisked off to her favorite boutique by Lady Victoria, who insisted on having a dress specially made. "Nothing too fancy," Margaret protested. "Nonsense," Lady Victoria replied. "You're going to be our keynote speaker. The president of the Royal Educational Society is coming specifically to hear about our intergenerational teaching model." As they went through fabric swatches together, Lady Victoria paused. "You know, Margaret, I've been thinking about my grandmother, the one who lived in these rooms before you. She would have absolutely adored what we're doing. She always said education was about more than books. It was about lifting people up to see their own potential." The dress they finally chose was elegant in its simplicity, a deep blue that matched the sapphire brooch that had become Margaret's signature accessory. As she tried it on in the boutique's fitting room, Margaret caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the confident, purposeful woman who looked back at her. The woman in the mirror wasn't defined by her past struggles or her present comfort. She was quite simply herself, a teacher who had never stopped believing in the power of education to transform lives, including her own. The Richardson Mansion had hosted many grand events over the years, but none quite like this. The guest list for the Trust's celebration gala was a remarkable blend of London's elite and those they traditionally only encountered through charitable donations. University chancellors mingled with former homeless teachers, tech entrepreneurs chatted with social workers, and aristocrats found themselves engaged in fascinating conversations with community organizers. The grand ballroom glowed with warm light from the crystal chandeliers, while photographs and digital displays showcased the Trust's work. Each table was named after a different influential educator from history, with carefully researched biographical notes that Margaret had prepared. "The Mary Wollstonecraft table is proving quite popular," Emma reported, expertly managing the flow of guests. She had insisted on working the event, rather than attending as a guest, though her new role as the Trust's technical support coordinator certainly warranted an invitation. Margaret stood at the entrance, greeting guests alongside James and Lady Victoria. Her blue dress caught the light perfectly, and the sapphire brooch seemed to glow with an inner fire. More striking than her outfit, however, was her presence. She radiated a quiet confidence that drew people to her naturally. "Mrs. Spencer," called out Professor Hamilton from Oxford's Education Department, "your paper on intergenerational knowledge transfer in digital environments is causing quite a stir in academic circles." Before Margaret could respond modestly, Lady Victoria stepped in. "Indeed it is. We are implementing its recommendations across all our programs. Margaret's insights are revolutionizing how we think about educational accessibility." The evening's program began with James addressing the gathered crowd. His usual corporate speaking style had evolved into something more personal and engaged. "6 months ago," he began, "I thought success was measured by market share and profit margins. Then I met someone who taught me that true wealth lies in what we give, not what we keep." As he spoke about the Trust's achievements, the hundreds of former teachers reconnected with students, the technological barriers broken down, the lives transformed, his eyes kept returning to Margaret, who, sat between his mother and Sarah, the young teacher from the shelter. Lady Victoria's speech followed, focusing on the importance of breaking down social barriers in education. "My grandmother," she said, touching the pearl necklace she wore, "used to say that true aristocracy was found in how we lift others up, not in how we keep them out." Then it was Margaret's turn. As she took her place at the podium, a gentle hush fell over the room. Her years of classroom experience showed in how naturally she commanded attention without demanding it. "Education," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "is not just about transferring knowledge. It's about preserving human dignity. Every person in this room has something to teach and something to learn. When I found myself living on London streets, I never stopped being a teacher. I simply had to wait for the right classroom to present itself." She went on to share stories from their programs, the retired physics teacher now running virtual science clubs for underprivileged students, the former headmistress organizing educational support for homeless families, the young teachers like Sarah, who had found their way back to their calling. "But perhaps the most important lesson we've learned," she continued, glancing at James and Lady Victoria, "is that family isn't defined by blood or background. It's created through understanding, acceptance, and the willingness to grow together." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt. As Margaret returned to her seat, she noticed tears in Lady Victoria's eyes, something she would have thought impossible a few months ago. Later in the evening, as guests mingled over dessert, the president of the Royal Educational Society approached their table. "Mrs. Spencer, Lady Richardson, Mr. Richardson, we would be honored to partner with the Trust in expanding these programs nationwide. Your model of combining traditional teaching wisdom with modern technology is exactly what our educational system needs." As the evening drew to a close, Margaret found herself in a quiet moment with James and Lady Victoria in the library, their shared sanctuary. Through the open doors, they could hear the happy chatter of guests departing, many deep in discussion about new collaborations and possibilities. "I never thought I'd say this," Lady Victoria mused, carefully removing her heels, "but I believe this was the most successful event we've ever hosted." And not a single person asked about the table settings or the wine selection. James laughed, loosening his bow tie. "They were too busy plotting educational revolutions, Mother. I saw you deep in conversation with that community centre director about expanding the program." Margaret sat in her favourite armchair, the sapphire brooch catching the lamplight. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "in all my years of teaching, I never imagined I would find myself here. But then again, the best classrooms are often in the most unexpected places." As autumn painted London in shades of gold and amber, the Trust's success brought unexpected challenges and opportunities. The nationwide expansion meant more responsibilities, more decisions, and more chances for the unlikely family to grow even closer. One crisp October morning, Margaret sat in her rooms, surrounded by letters from potential program participants. Each envelope contained a story of hope and resilience, former teachers eager to reconnect with their calling, despite circumstances that had pushed them to the margins of society. A knock at the door revealed Lady Victoria, carrying a leather-bound album Margaret hadn't seen before. "I found this while clearing out the attic," she said, settling into the window seat beside Margaret. "It belonged to James's grandmother, her personal journal from when she taught evacuee children during the war." Together they pored over the yellowed pages filled with elegant handwriting. The journal detailed how the mansion had once served as an informal school for children displaced by the London Blitz. "So this house has been a place of learning before," Margaret observed, touching the faded photographs of children studying in the very library they now used. "History has a way of repeating itself in the most beautiful ways," Lady Victoria replied, pausing at a particular entry. "Look at this. She writes about teaching children from all social backgrounds, how the war made those distinctions meaningless compared to the importance of education." James found them still engrossed in the journal hours later. His entrance was accompanied by exciting news from his company's board meeting. "They've unanimously approved the creation of a dedicated educational technology division," he announced. "We'll be developing specialized software specifically for our senior teachers to use with students facing challenges." The announcement led to an impromptu celebration dinner, during which Emma shared her own news. The technical support program she'd developed for elderly teachers had caught the attention of several educational technology firms. "They want to implement it nationwide," she said, blushing slightly at the attention. "They're offering me a position as program director, but—" She hesitated, looking around the table. "I'd rather stay here and continue developing it with the trust." "My dear," Lady Victoria reached across the table to pat Emma's hand. "You must do both. The trust needs someone overseeing technical implementation at a national level, and who better than the person who helped build it from scratch?" Margaret watched this exchange with quiet pride. The walls between staff and family had dissolved so naturally that no one even remarked on it anymore. The household had become exactly that, a home where roles were defined by contribution rather than convention. Later that evening, as the autumn rain tapped against the windows, Margaret received an unexpected video call. Sarah, the young teacher they'd helped, was calling from her new classroom in Manchester, where she'd been implementing the Trust's programs. "Margaret, you won't believe what happened today." Sarah's face was alight with excitement. "Remember that quiet boy I told you about, the one living in temporary housing? He scored top marks in his science test after attending our virtual tutoring sessions. These small victories were what made their work meaningful. Every success story, every child helped, every teacher restored to their profession, added to the growing evidence that their approach was working." The next morning, during their weekly staff meeting, now held around the kitchen table over fresh scones and tea, they discussed the latest developments. The Royal Educational Society's partnership had opened doors they hadn't anticipated. "They want us to present our model at an international education conference in Edinburgh," James announced. "All of us, Mother, Margaret, Emma, even Sarah via video link. They're calling it the Richardson Revolution in Educational Access." Lady Victoria sniffed slightly at this. "I still think they should call it the Spencer Method. After all, Margaret's the heart of this entire endeavor." "No," Margaret said firmly, looking around at the faces that had become her family. "This has never been about any one person. It's about what happens when people from different walks of life come together with a shared purpose." As if to emphasize her point, the doorbell rang. Emma returned from answering it with a group of their regular Thursday afternoon teachers. The program had grown so much that they now needed multiple sessions throughout the week. Watching them settle in, pulling out tablets and laptops with increasing confidence, Margaret reflected on how far they'd all come. The mansion's formal dining room, once a showcase for wealth and status, now hummed with the energy of purpose and possibility. Lady Victoria, expertly managing the tea service she had once considered beneath her, caught Margaret's eye and smiled. They both knew that the true revolution wasn't in the technology or the teaching methods. It was in the breaking down of barriers that had kept people apart for far too long. December brought a blanket of snow to London, transforming the Richardson Mansion's gardens into a winter wonderland. Inside, the house buzzed with preparations for what Lady Victoria had dubbed the People's Christmas Party, a celebration that would bring together everyone involved in the Trust's programs. "We'll need more chairs," Emma fretted, looking at the growing guest list. "And the dining room simply won't hold everyone." "Then we'll use the entire ground floor," Lady Victoria declared. "Open all the rooms, just like Grandmother did during the war. Margaret, what do you think?" Margaret looked up from the tablet where she'd been reviewing end-of-year reports. "I think it's perfect. A house this size should be full of life and purpose, especially at Christmas." What none of them knew was that James had been orchestrating a surprise of his own. For weeks he'd been in secret communications with various officials and organizations, coordinating something special for Margaret. The preparations for the party transformed the mansion. Every room glowed with warm light and festive decorations, but with a thoughtful touch that reflected their mission. The Christmas trees in each room were decorated with ornaments made by students in their programs, each one telling a story of resilience and hope. On the morning of the party, Margaret woke to find a small envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a note from James. "Your presence is requested in the library at 10 a.m. Formal attire suggested." Puzzled but intrigued, Margaret dressed in her favorite winter outfit, a deep green wool dress that Lady Victoria had insisted on having made for her. The sapphire brooch, now as much a part of her daily attire as her reading glasses, provided the perfect accent. When she entered the library, she found not just James and Lady Victoria, but a distinguished group of visitors, including the Lord Mayor of London and representatives from various educational institutions. "Margaret Spencer," the Lord Mayor began, his voice warm with genuine respect, "it gives me great pleasure to inform you that you have been nominated and selected for the Queen's Honours List in recognition of your exceptional services to education and social integration." Margaret's hand flew to her brooch, her eyes wide with surprise, but the Mayor wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the University of London wishes to offer you an honorary doctorate in education in recognition of your innovative work in bridging generational and social divides through education." Lady Victoria, standing beside Margaret, squeezed her hand tightly. James beamed with pride from across the room, while Emma wiped tears from her eyes. I don't know what to say," Margaret began, but was interrupted by the arrival of more guests, familiar faces from her past, former students, now grown with children of their own, colleagues from her teaching days, even the manager from her old shelter, all gathered to share in this moment. "Say you'll accept," James smiled, "and then help us celebrate with about 300 of your closest friends and admirers who are arriving this afternoon." The Christmas party that followed was unlike anything the old mansion had ever seen. The formal rooms rang with laughter and conversation as people from all walks of life celebrated together. Children from their programs performed carols in the entrance hall, their voices rising to the rafters. In the library, now transformed into a cozy gathering space with comfortable chairs and warm drinks, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and former students eager to share their stories. "Mrs. Spencer," one middle-aged man approached her, "you probably don't remember me, but you were my teacher in 1985. You helped me believe in myself when nobody else did. Now I'm a headmaster, trying to do the same for my students." Lady Victoria, overhearing this, exchanged a meaningful look with her son. Their home had become exactly what they'd needed it to be, not a showcase of wealth, but a center of genuine human connection and growth. As evening fell and fairy lights twinkled in the snow-covered gardens, James gathered everyone in the grand hall for an announcement. Standing on the main staircase, he surveyed the diverse crowd before him, teachers and students, wealthy donors and community workers, all united in purpose. "Today we celebrate not just Christmas, but the power of education to transform lives. The trust is expanding thanks to all of you. But more importantly, we celebrate the woman who showed us that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we share." Margaret stood quietly at the foot of the stairs, the sapphire brooch gleaming against her green dress, surrounded by the family she had found and the community she had helped build. In her wildest dreams during those cold nights on London streets, she could never have imagined this moment. But perhaps the greatest gift of all was watching Lady Victoria, the woman who had once been so suspicious of her, now proudly introducing her to everyone as "my dear friend Margaret," though really, she's more like a sister. As March brought the first hints of spring to London, the Richardson mansion was undergoing yet another transformation. The success of their Christmas celebration had inspired a new initiative, the conversion of the mansion's extensive grounds into an educational garden space, complete with outdoor classrooms and a community vegetable patch. "Here's what Grandmother would have wanted," Lady Victoria declared, reviewing the plans spread across the library table. "She always said these gardens were wasted on mere ornamental displays." Margaret, now Professor Spencer, thanks to her honorary doctorate, had thrown herself into the garden project with characteristic enthusiasm. Her vision combined Victorian educational principles with modern environmental awareness, creating spaces where students could learn about everything from botany to literature in an outdoor setting. "We'll have Shakespeare in the Rose Garden," she explained to a group of visiting educators, "and mathematics among the geometric flower beds. Learning doesn't need 4 walls and a whiteboard." The project had captured the imagination of the entire household. Emma had developed a mobile app that would allow students to scan plants and access educational content about them. The chef had started filming cooking demonstrations using produce from the vegetable garden, creating content for their virtual learning platform. One sunny morning, as Margaret supervised the planting of a new herb garden, she noticed James standing at his study window, watching the activity below with an unusually contemplative expression. Later, over tea in the conservatory, he shared what had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about stepping back from the company," he said, carefully stirring his tea. Not entirely, but enough to focus more on the Trust's work. The board supports the idea. They think having me more involved in our educational technology division would be good for our public image. Lady Victoria, who would once have been horrified at the idea of her son stepping away from the corporate world, simply nodded. It makes sense. The Trust needs more direct leadership as it expands. Besides, she added with a smile, you've never looked happier than when you're working with our teachers and students. The changes weren't limited to the mansion's grounds. The Trust's success had inspired similar initiatives across the country. Sarah, their once homeless teacher, now ran her own branch in Manchester, helping other educators rebuild their lives while serving their communities. It's like ripples in a pond, Margaret observed during one of their weekly video calls with program coordinators around the country. Each person we help creates their own circle of positive change. The mansion itself had evolved into a true community hub. The formal dining room was now permanently set up as a teaching space, with the massive table perfect for group projects. The drawing room hosted regular seminars and workshops, its elegant decor providing an inspiring backdrop for learning. Even Lady Victoria's social circle had transformed. Her friends now competed to be involved in the Trust's work, rather than just its social events. The sapphire brooch that had once caused so much trouble had inspired a Heritage for Education program, where wealthy families donated historical items to be used as teaching tools in history and cultural education. One evening, as Margaret sat in her rooms reviewing applications for their summer program, she found a leather-bound journal on her desk. Inside was a note from Lady Victoria. "Dear Margaret, I thought it was time you had your own journal to record this journey. Future generations should know how one person's dignity and determination can change so many lives. With love, Victoria." The journal's pages were blank, waiting to be filled with new stories of transformation and hope. As Margaret began to write, she reflected on how far they'd all come from that cold day when she'd first met James. The Trust was no longer just a program. It had become a movement, proving that education could bridge any gap, heal any divide, and open doors that seemed forever closed. But more than that, it had shown that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that true wealth was measured not in possessions, but in the lives touched and changed. Outside her window, the garden's new paths gleamed in the spring sunshine, while students from their program worked alongside professional gardeners, learning as they helped create their own outdoor classroom. The sound of their laughter floated up to her room, mixing with the birdsong and the distant hum of London traffic. It was, Margaret thought as she continued writing, exactly the kind of music a home should make. The symphony of purpose, learning, and joy, all playing together in perfect harmony. 1 year to the day since Margaret first walked through the Richardson Mansion's doors, she stood in the garden, watching the sun rise over their newly completed outdoor learning centre. The morning light caught the dew on the roses, creating tiny rainbows that seemed to celebrate all they had achieved. The mansion had transformed from a symbol of wealth and privilege into a beacon of hope and possibility. Every room now served a purpose beyond mere display, every corner filled with the energy of learning and growth. But more remarkable than the physical changes were the transformations in the people who called it home. Lady Victoria, once so concerned with social status, now spent her mornings teaching etiquette classes to homeless youth, not to change them, but to give them tools to navigate a world that often judged too quickly. Her famous jewelry collection, once kept safely locked away, now formed part of a living history exhibition that traveled to schools across the country. "Do you remember," she said to Margaret as they prepared for the day's activities, "when I was worried about what people would think? Now they're all trying to copy our model. Lady Pembroke has even turned her country estate into a science learning centre." James, who had indeed stepped back from his CEO position to focus on the Trust, had found his true calling in combining technology with social purpose. His corporate experience proved invaluable in scaling their programs nationwide, while his newfound passion for teaching gave him the joy his business success never had. The morning's main event was the inauguration of their latest initiative, the Second Chances Academy. It was a comprehensive program that combined housing support, education, and job training for elderly professionals who had fallen on hard times. The idea had grown directly from Margaret's own experience. As guests arrived for the ceremony, Margaret watched from her favorite spot in the library. The room still served as her sanctuary, but now it buzzed with life and purpose. Students of all ages browsed the shelves, while retired teachers worked with young learners at the long tables. The space had become exactly what a library should be, a bridge between knowledge and need. Emma, now the Trust's Director of Educational Technology, had developed a groundbreaking platform that connected isolated elderly teachers with students around the world. Her innovation had earned her a prestigious technology award, but she still insisted on personally running the mansion's weekly computer classes. Some things, she'd say, are too important to delegate. Sarah arrived from Manchester for the ceremony, bringing news of similar programs sprouting up across the north of England. Her success story had inspired others, creating a network of support and opportunity that stretched far beyond London's boundaries. As Margaret prepared to address the gathered crowd, she fingered the sapphire brooch that had become a symbol of her journey. Lady Victoria had officially gifted it to her on her honorary doctorate ceremony, saying it had found its true home. "Distinguished guests," Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, but more importantly, dear friends and family. 1 year ago, I stood on these grounds as a stranger, welcomed by an act of kindness that would change not just my life, but countless others. She paused, looking at the faces before her. James, his eyes bright with purpose. Lady Victoria, elegant as ever, but now with a warmth that transformed her. Beauty. Emma, Sarah, and all the others who had become part of their extraordinary family. Today we celebrate not just the opening of the Second Chances Academy, but the truth that it represents, that it's never too late to learn, to teach, to grow, to find family in strangers, and to transform loss into legacy. The applause that followed was interrupted by an unexpected announcement. From James and Lady Victoria, they were officially transferring ownership of the mansion to the Trust, ensuring its future as an educational centre in perpetuity. After all, Lady Victoria declared, her eyes twinkling, what better legacy could there be than turning privilege into possibility? As the celebration continued around her, Margaret took a moment to walk through the gardens. The paths were lined with benches donated by successful students, each bearing a plaque with a story of transformation. The vegetable garden flourished under the care of their community programs, providing food for local shelters and lessons in sustainability. She stopped at a newly installed fountain in the center of the rose garden. The plaque read, "In honor of all those who teach us that family is found not in blood, but in bonds of love and purpose. The Richardson Spencer Family Trust." The spring breeze carried the sound of laughter and learning from every corner of the property. In the outdoor classroom, a former concert pianist who had lost everything was teaching music to disadvantaged children. In the technology hub, elderly teachers were mastering virtual reality educational tools. Every space held a story of renewal and purpose. Margaret smiled, thinking of that cold day when she'd first met James, how she'd refused his money but accepted his humanity. She hadn't known then that she was teaching her most important lesson, that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we share. The mansion stood proud against the spring sky, no longer just a house but a home in the truest sense, a place where past and future met, where privilege became purpose, and where family meant something far broader and deeper than blood. As new visitors arrived for afternoon programs, Margaret straightened her brooch and went to welcome them. After all, every ending was just another beginning, and there were always more lessons to share, more lives to touch, more stories to write in the ongoing chapter of their extraordinary family.